Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you for staying with us after a very stormy session that we have just had. And most of the issues that are going to be discussed in this one, in a way, were mentioned along the day, but I think that still there is some very special points that are going to be raised and discussed in this particular one. So I'll do it in the following way. First, I will, my name is Cohn. Those of you who do not know, I'm from Aviv University. At the moment, I'm the director of the Martin Buber Society of Fellows, and finishing my office as the director, as the head of the School of the Arts at that university. And I'm a psychologist. As you see, the title of this session is The Humanities, Ethics, and Religion. And we have two speakers today, Professor Menachem Fisch and Professor Dani Statman. And I will start with introducing our speakers, and then I will move to a very short expose on my behalf, just in order to somehow connect to the topics that I think maybe will help us to get on with the subjects, the major topics, which is the interest of this particular workshop. So, Professor Menachem Fisch is a Joseph and Sail Mazer Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at Tel Aviv University, and chair of the Cohn Institute's Board and Academic Committee, and co-editor of the HOPOS, the Journal of the International Society for the History of the Philosophy of Science. Professor Fisch is also a senior fellow of the Kogot Center for the Renewal of Jewish Thought at the Shalom Hartman Institute, chair of the Graduate School of Philosophy, and the director of the Center for Religious and Interreligious Studies, both at Tel Aviv University. You will hear all of these different titles are related to what we are going to hear very soon. I would like to, especially to mention here that Professor Fisch has published widely on the history of 19th century British science and mathematics, on confirmation theory and rationality, on the theology of the Talmudic literature, and we have in the morning a very interesting illustration from this knowledge of yours, and the philosophy of Talmudic legal reasoning. His current work explores the limits of normative self-criticism, the Talmud's dispute of religiosity, and many other interesting topics. And I would like, of them, I would like to mention also the historiography of scientific framework transitions, because this is also very much related to our various topics of these 2 days. Now, Professor Dani Statman is a professor of philosophy at the University of Haifa and a research fellow at the Institute of Israel Democracy, saying it rightly, IDI, and at the Shalom Hartman Institute. They are all in Jerusalem, for those of you who do not know. His areas of specialization are ethics, moral philosophy, the philosophy of law, and Jewish philosophy. He is the author and editor of many books and articles, including Moral Dilemmas, Religion and Morality, State and Religion, Moral Lack, and Virtue Ethics. In recent years, he has published extensively in the area of war and ethics on topics such as targeting killing, supreme emergencies, and more. And this is, of course, related to the whole idea of applied ethics, which I think that will be part of our discussion. He was involved in the committee that revised the ethical code of the IDF, a committee that reviews requests for exemption from army service on grounds of conscience, and the committee that decides which new medical technologies and medicines should be covered by the National Medical Insurance. So all of them are related to the topic of today. Now, there are 3 major elements in the topic of this session: the humanities, ethics, and religion, and they are not, on the face of it, commensurable with each other. The humanities, and since Menachem Norbom beforehand mentioned the Paideia, I think that it's worth mentioning that the humanities, in the great humanist tradition we inherit from Renaissance and early and late modern scholarship, relate to the 3 major modes of thought, which are the philological, the hermeneutical and the historical. While the first two relate to a proper understanding of texts, and not only linguistic, also musical, archaeological, pictorial, etc., the second to a proper understanding, I mean the historical, to a proper understanding of events. They throw light in different ways to dynamics of transformations, and as such deployed in variety of cultural contexts and in relation to endless amount of artifacts and processes. Philosophy, older than these three, and a tradition unto itself, aims at a different kind of knowledge concerning the content and accuracy of our leading concepts of the mind and of human existence and values, and their interconnectivity in relation to understanding, action, and critical judgment. Ethics, our second topic this afternoon, connects the philosophical to the normative, and as such to law with the aspiration, in terms of Kant's critique of practical reason, to pragmatically instruct the sciences, medicine, technology, and the army, many other fields beyond academia in variety of ethical concerns. Religion, our third subject, is a phenomenon more than a body of knowledge, or at least we believe it to be one, a sort of abstract entity that links together a huge variety of human activities and written and unwritten beliefs and prescriptions. For the phenomena it wishes to encompass, religion, as a discipline, once it becomes a science of religion, it deploys all those modes of research mentioned above, philology, hermeneutics, history, conceptual thinking, and yet it does not stop there, moving further to younger disciplinary frames such as sociology and psychology. Still, in its very core, it asks time and again, to paraphrase Harold Fish, is there indeed a religion in the class? I believe that religion is not only the only field in which such ontological questions are being raised. Also, musicology, which is closer to my heart, a much newer disciplinary frame, suffers from identity problem. Is there indeed something that connects the various manifestations of sound in the world of human and maybe also non-humans? Is it important to find and reify such something? These queries hold for art in general. How all this affects teaching and learning? These are questions that I have asked myself continuously in my capacity in the last years as the head of the School of the Arts in relation to a desired or necessary curriculum for students of the various performative arts. We are doing such things also in the Faculty of Humanities nowadays, and I think that Dror Warman has left us to think about what is indeed the core thing. So it's related to all these issues, and since we have in the final analysis to go back to the question of curricula, so I think that we may connect to the question, is there indeed a core curriculum? And this is related to some of the issues that I have raised now. And now I want to move to our speakers. And first, Professor Fisch will start.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a fascinating day, and I hope I don't spoil it for you. I'll get to religion eventually, but I want to beat around the bush a little. First, to get to it via a more general concern that addresses a more general concern I think is pertinent to this workshop, which eventually religion will exemplify. Yehuda Elkanah will be remembered for many things and has been already remembered for many things in this workshop. But I think, and thank you, Jürgen, for mentioning it first, two-tier thinking, at least for a philosopher like me, his firm neo-Kantian distinction between our second-order normative frameworks and the first-order realms of reasoning they constitute stands out, at least for me in particular. Kant, as we all know, viewed the frameworks constitutive of science and of the moral law as hardwired into the human psyche and into the very idea of law, respectively, and hence fixed for all time. Yehuda, by contrast, insisted on there being a plurality of diverse human frameworks with regard to all human endeavor, including science and ethics. And two-tier thinking bristles with intriguing insights, but it harbors an ambiguity which I'd like to say a word about. It sets forth with a very strong statement for which Yehuda is probably best known, to take seriously the diversity of human frameworks and their constitutive role with regard to the forms of reasoning and practices that they determine, requires, as he puts it, and I quote, and we all remember this quote, and Jorgen actually mentioned it, that we must be realists in our chosen frameworks, yet relativists with regard to the frameworks themselves. Now, this could not be right. For a framework to perform its constitutive function and determine the standards of propriety for those it governs, it must be wholeheartedly committed to it. They must be wholeheartedly committed to it. If Cohn has taught us anything, the process by which frameworks acquire their constitutive status is one of enculturation and assimilation, by which they eventually become what John McDowell, who was mentioned before too, calls second nature. This is by no means a matter of choice. Yehuda talks about choosing frameworks. It's not a matter of choice at all, as Yehuda's opening quip implies, if only because, as Harry Frankfurt, who hasn't been mentioned and should be mentioned perhaps, once put it, one can't change one's will by will, as an act of will. Now, even the most ultra-Orthodox Jew is well aware that the vast majority of people live by the lights or the drums of value systems very different from his own. And he will also admit that had the circumstances been different, so would he. But that doesn't render him a relativist with respect to the Haredi framework to which he is wholeheartedly committed. The norms by which we hold ourselves accountable they go without saying. They constitute the most basic level of our tacit knowledge, and that hasn't been mentioned today and is a major concept of this conference. They speak for us in the first person. They comprise the very core of our self and agency. We can't be relativists with respect to the frameworks that ground our world and who we are, any more than we can be relativists with respect to that very world and those very selves. Our frameworks are as real can be, framework dependently real, yet real nonetheless. Now, Yehuda seems to have realized what he'd got himself into, because by the end of the paper, something becomes seriously undone. He changes his tune completely. Unlike his initial iconic statement, the realist-relativist divide is now made to run not between the two tiers of thinking, relativists about the second realm and realist about the first, as at the outset, but between considering a framework from within or from without, which is a very, very different matter entirely. And I'm quoting again, the scientist cannot but be a realist, he now claims. The historian cannot but be a relativist. The philosopher's choice is open, depending on whether he adopts the scientist or the historian viewpoint. Now, the initial excitement has all but fizzled out in favor of the commonplace truism about the difference between looking in and looking out, that takes, in all seriousness, the inherent and all-embracing two-tier realism from within, taking that seriously. From within, we cannot but be realists, as scientists are, frameworks lock, stock, and barrel, with regard to both tiers. Now, but my point is that despite his waffling in this paper, Yehuda was onto something very deep and important. Let's stay with the scientist, or more generally with the view from within a framework, mainly because historians who are worth their mettle should be interested in emulating the practitioner's perspective rather than their own, to understand the realism from within rather than to apply their relativism from without. The problem I want to raise has little to do with the realist-relativist question, and it's a problem that has stumped the philosophical literature to the point of paralysis. So Dr. Yehuda's view of frameworks and their radical diversity. That is to say, to firmly reject both Kant's impossibly rigid view of the timeless fixedness of ethics and science's second tier, as well as Popper's hopelessly simplistic pooh-poohing of the very idea of a second tier. That was to remind you, is the title of his last collection of essays. The myth, not of the given, the myth of the framework. Okay. So to reject both these positions obliges us to hold ourselves and others accountable, not only for living up to the standards to which we're committed, but to holding to such standards in the first place. Socialists usually criticize capitalists, not for not being capitalists enough, but for being capitalists. Not for not living up to their capitalist standards. As rational agents, we would like our critical reflection to extend to the norms and the standards by which we criticize. But how is that possible? Die-hard Kantians, as I've already mentioned, are exempt from second-order critical reflection. And die-hard Popperians fool themselves into thinking that they can criticize just anything. But to take Yehuda's two-tier thinking seriously, and I believe we cannot but take his two-tier thinking seriously, we seem to have no rational hold on the normative frameworks that govern our reason from within, despite the fact that they are modified and replaced from time to time. For to claim that norms and standards can be modified and changed for a reason is to claim that they can be normatively faulted by those whose reasoning they govern, which is a problem widely considered to be insurmountable. A framework can be troubleshot from within for clarity, coherence, and consistency, but a system of norms cannot be normatively impeached, it is argued, by the very principles of normative reckoning to which it gives rise. This is the philosophical problem or scandal with which I believe Yehuda's papers tacitly contends. Problem concerning, Helga, the inherent limits of criticism. The inherent limits of criticism, which is the master value of education, of rationality, of science. To liken the rationality of paradigm shifts, as Cohn infamously does in Structure, to that of religious conversions or gestalt switches is as preposterous as Popper's denial of there being a problem. But what alternative do we have? My own 2 cents worth has been to argue over the years that although we are incapable, in principle, of framing a valid argument against the normative viability of the norms to which we are truly committed, and for the same reason we are incapable of being convinced to do so by arguments leveled at us by others, still, and this has been my argument, exposure to normative criticism from without, though powerless to convince, can on occasion destabilize commitment sufficiently to render us normatively ambivalent towards the norms it questions, something we can never achieve alone. This is, as the famous ad on TV, this is what friends are for. This is something one cannot do alone, like keep oneself company. Left to our own devices, the self-critical fault lines of the reflective self run rigidly and unchangeably from within between Yehuda's 2 tiers. But exposure to the echo chamber of external critics, I've tried to show, can change those fault lines for us. When the inner dialogue of the self is appropriately set in the context of a keen exchange with others who think differently from us, who are committed differently from us, effective, transformative, normative self-criticism becomes an option, and with it the possibility of rational framework transition. How this works exactly we can talk about in discussion if you're interested. But from the little I've said, it follows that talking about framework transitions, the initial source of critical input, responsible in the long run for transforming a field must be external to it, which is not how scientific framework transitions are usually described at all. However, although a field can only be ambivalated from without, it can only be transformed from within. Only a physicist can change physics. Such transitions must therefore be thought of as two-stage processes in which practitioners of standing are first ambivalated by external critics, and then somehow later succeed in promulgating their newfound indecision or ambivalence inside their communities. Now, because ambivalence and uncertainty are usually relegated far from the public eye to the personal correspondence, to the diary, and to the personal memoir, this second stage, I have argued, is achieved when the doubts and indecision of such individuals come tacitly to inform the creative efforts, their creative efforts to overcome them. Such efforts will typically take the form of an easily split hybrid attempt to represent their fields, basic assumptions, by retaining some of the old while groping imaginatively towards new possibilities in an impossibly hybridic structure. Classical examples are Tycho Brahe's planetary theory, Galileo's analysis of projectile motion, which in the classic book you bring out very, very well. Poincaré's geometrical conventionalism, George Peacock, my favorites, Janus-faced algebra, and the strained grafting of Kantian and empiricist, impossible grafting of Kantian and empiricist elements in William Whewell's philosophy of science. Now, when analyzed prospectively, such works can be seen to have preserved and therefore propagated the keen ambivalence that begot them, prompting others to take a bolder stand and seeking a cleaner break and more radical one. So the idea that the key to normative reassessment lies not in the blinding dazzle of the knockdown experimentus crucis, the decisive refutation or the bold conjecture, but in the intermediary moments of discordant ambivalence and painful indecision, originating in challenges to the field from without, requires us, I think, to seriously rethink how we teach the history of our subjects and how we train our students for novel breakthroughs, both their content and their methods, something which was raised before, which for the sake of brevity, I'd like briefly to demonstrate by means of two unique initiatives at Tel Aviv, one very, very new and one very well established. Regarding the first, the new one, how to teach our subjects in the humanities, I would like to introduce you to the new Center of Religious and Interreligious Studies we're establishing at Tel Aviv. Religious studies is a better example than science in this regard, because religious conviction runs much deeper, as Yaron mentioned in one of his responses, and is deemed by practitioners in terms far more absolute than most normative commitments. Secondly, because the synchronic diversity of religious commitment is far more evident, the diachronic succession of scientific frameworks. And finally, to follow up on Jürgen's suggestion, religions as objects of study are themselves shifting and changing almost as they are studied in a manner far less dramatic than the planet. But I think this will bring out that your example of what we're doing to the planet is really a paradigm for any object, culturally, humanly involved object we study in the humanities. The idea that motivates the center is that in defiance of the three religions' myths of purity, authenticity, and exclusive integral truth, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have developed in fertile, fervid, and mutually formative interaction, more meaningful than the unwitting impacts of other contextual factors. So much so that it is impossible to properly understand any significant moment in the life of any one of them without taking into serious account the real and imagined, conscious and unconscious give and take between the community under study and the other two, or rather the way they perceived or imagined the other two. The center is dedicated, therefore, to studying and teaching the three faiths interreligiously rather than merely comparatively, as the developing outcomes of intense and dynamic interreligious interaction on all levels of religious life. To do so seriously, the three religions must therefore be studied under the same roof by experts in each, working in close collaboration. The other thing is that this is a project no university can really undertake alone. It has to be a collaboration between universities. Tel Aviv has forged such collaborations both with Cambridge and with Frankfurt. But the important point for today's discussion is to appreciate how thinking about religion dynamically, in dialogical rather than comparative terms, necessarily shifts attention from the center to the peripheries of interreligious interface, to their shared bridging interlanguages, to the ambivalated and potentially ambivalating go-betweens, the converts, the translators, the merchants, the envoys, the scholars, and the functionaries, knowingly and unknowingly smuggling religious content across these divides, giving rise to new and creatively Hebridic expressions of religiosity whose subsequent careers in the religious heartlands can then be meticulously tracked. I could go on and on about this, but I think you get the idea. And the same applies to how the histories of science and politics and philosophy and law, music, art, and literature should be studied and taught, I would argue. The second unique Tel Aviv initiative celebrates 28 this year and was created single-handedly by Yehuda. And I'm referring, and it was mentioned before, of course, to the interdisciplinary program for fostering excellence, which is geared deliberately to ambivalating a small group of exceptionally gifted students by requiring them to skip the BA and train themselves in at least two distinct disciplines and produce MA theses that are required to straddle the interdisciplinary divides. And it has been a remarkable success. And what I'd like to say is that in two-tier thinking, Yehuda duly ambivalated by the realist relativist controversy, produced a thought-provoking theoretical reflection of rare Hebridic indecision. I mean, when you read it for the ambivalence it harbors, it's just that. But he seems, so typically of him, to have been able to see through it a few years later and resolve his initial ambivalence, not in a new philosophical reflection, but in building an institute, which he was so good at. So I would like to dedicate this session, or at least my contribution to it, to his wonderful gift for translating half-baked, creatively undecided ideas into thriving institutions. Thank you very much.